Some people ask about whether the fourth gospel, called John's Gospel, actually was written by John the Apostle. And I think it was. It does claim to be by an eyewitness, and it lists various people within the gospel, and it does so in such a way as not to say explicitly who the author is. But in the earliest manuscripts, they always used to have a running header across the top of the page, and in those running headers from the earliest times, this is called According to John. And we also have a figure who is in the late 2nd century called Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who in turn was a disciple of John the Apostle. And Irenaeus actually has some of this fourth gospel in front of him, and he quotes it, and he says, this comes from John the Apostle. Now, that might not strike people as very significant, but that's actually a better attestation for John being by John than we have for almost any of Plato's works being by Plato. Because what you do with a lot of the classical works is you have some medieval list which lists works by Plato, and you have a manuscript which says Plato's dialogue, and you match them up, and you say, well, that shows it's authentic. But what you don't usually have is someone actually quoting from a text and saying, this is some of its wording, and then saying, and it was by this person. Certainly not that close. So, I think you can make a pretty good case that John wrote the fourth gospel. The earliest agreed fragment of the New Testament is the Rylands Papyrus in Manchester, which comes from the 2nd century. Many would say the first half of the 2nd century, but with dates that are based on handwriting, it's never possible to be completely certain. So there are other documents that are pretty early in Oxford. In fact, the interesting thing is that there's a document in Oxford which is of John chapter 18, and the one in Manchester is also of John chapter 18, and they're both from the middle of the 2nd century. So you get John's Gospel spread very quickly, and so that's why there are copies of it. Of course, from time to time there are claims of earlier texts still, but none of those have yet been verified or agreed in public. You'd need to have a manuscript, you need to have images of a manuscript so you can study it, and you have paleographers who study ancient dating to check that, and that hasn't been the case for anything earlier. The 2nd century is incredibly early. It means the gap between the writings and the earliest copies we have is less than a century. Now, you compare that with, let's say, Homer's Iliad, where you're going to have many centuries, or many of the classical works, some of them even as much as 1,000 years you can have a gap between when they were written and our earliest copy. So if we're prepared to accept that classical literature has been well handed down to us, many classical writings we only have in a single document, or the documents are incredibly late, and yet people are prepared to accept that these are the real things. You'll get penguin translations of ancient classical writers. The gap between the New Testament, the earliest writings of the New Testament, earliest manuscripts we have of the New Testament, and the New Testament itself is far, far smaller. So I think if we're prepared to accept that most of classical literature has been well handed down, there's every reason to accept that the New Testament has been too.